Today we are celebrating the launch of Baldwin, A Love Story, the first major biography of James Baldwin in over 30 years. This rich book gives us a new perspective on James Baldwin's life and work through significant relationships in his life. And since its launch, it's continuously receiving praise. Charles Blow of the New York Times says, "It dazzles and awes, the kind of masterly narrative ability achieved only with deep research and deep understanding. Stunning, a book whose true beauty allows Baldwin to reveal himself slowly and almost tenderly." We're thrilled to have the New York Times bestselling author Nicholas Boggs with us today. He will be in conversation with Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, Emmy-nominated filmmaker, and Tony-nominated theatrical producer Jose Antonio Vargas, and in an exclusive to the museum portion of this event, we also have award-winning narrator, actor, and coach Ron Butler, who voiced the audio version of the book. The first reading is when a young James Baldwin meets his mentor, the artist Beauford Delaney. Please join me in welcoming Ron to the stage.
It was with a growing sense of anticipation that the young James Baldwin finished sweeping the floors at his after-school job at a sweatshop on Canal Street and headed out toward the unfamiliar address, 181 Green Street. As he left the garment district and entered the lamplit streets of Greenwich Village, it was as if he were entering another country altogether. To passers-by on the street, the 16-year-old must have looked like a stranger in the village. Indeed, a short, scrawny, dark-skinned figure, wide-eyed and weary in wrinkled work clothes a size too big. For a moment, he considered boarding the uptown train and returning to his family's Harlem apartment. But he dreaded going home, as he would later describe how he felt that day, and there was something about Emile's insistence upon giving him this address that kept urging him forward. Beauford Delaney was already a well-known figure in the village, and his reputation was about to explode with the publication of his friend and fellow artist Henry Miller's essay, The Amazing and Invariable Beauford Delaney. Beauford's studio was a heavenly abode full of canvases mad with color, and so cold its stove couldn't possibly warm the chill of the grave which emanates from its dripping walls, floors, and ceiling. The streets outside were infested with the sinister shadows of crime, and with prowling alley cats which thrive on garbage and ordure that litter the gutter and pavements. But even these exaggerated descriptions would not deter locals and out-of-town visitors alike from finding their way to Beauford's studio. There they would wait outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of the unusual man who hobnobbed with artists and celebrities such as Canada Lee, Ethel Waters, Alfred Stieglitz, Georgia O'Keeffe, and Marian Anderson, and who was characterized by those who met him as a shaman, a Buddha-like figure, even a minor deity. Baldwin arrived at the address to find a faded brick tenement that was no different from the others on the tree-lined block, rows of zigzagging fire escapes angling up into the night sky. After he pushed his way through the front door and climbed the decrepit stairs, he tried to control his nerves as he knocked on the door. "A short, round, brown man came to the door and looked at me," he later wrote, "with the most extraordinary eyes I'd ever seen." He was only in his mid-30s, but to Baldwin he looked ancient. And after he had finished his instant x-ray of my brain, lungs, liver, heart, bowels, and spinal column, while I had said, usefully, "Emile sent me," he smiled and said, "Come in," and opened the door. It was a modest studio, warmed only by a black pot-bellied stove. But for Baldwin, the drama of Beauford's presence there had transformed even its fire escape into the most exclusive terrace in Manhattan or Bombay. Like many before him, he was most entranced by the sight of the colorful canvases and then by the easels, some of which were turned against the walls, while others were covered by white sheets. Then he fixed his eyes on the old Victrola phonograph, and it wouldn't be long before he was spending hours with Beauford listening to records, scratchy music with the voices of blues singers wafting through the air at all hours of the day and night. I had grown up with music, Baldwin would write, by which he meant church music. But now, on Beauford's small black record player, I began to hear what I had never dared or been able to hear. Louis Armstrong, Bessie Smith, Ella Fitzgerald, and Fats Waller. He would come by as often as he could after school or after he got off from work, and sometimes they would sing along, Beauford's deep voice blending with Baldwin's high tenor. Other times they would simply listen. When they did talk, unlike Baldwin's father, Beauford did not lecture him. Instead, he spoke to him in a soft voice and taught him how to really hear jazz and the blues, not as the degraded, God-forsaken mediums his father had said they were, but as part of his heritage. These early sessions would begin to unlock something for him as a budding writer that even all his reading in the libraries and his conversations with Bill Miller could not. When I realized that music, rather than American literature, was really my language, he later said, I was no longer afraid, and then I could really write. Almost miraculously, it seemed, Baldwin had found in Beauford, as he would put it, walking, living proof, for me, that a black man could be an artist. Also born into a religious household with many siblings, in his case, in Knoxville, Tennessee, Beauford had found a way to pursue his ambitions as a painter by making his way to Boston and then to New York City. At first, he had settled in Harlem at the tail end of its new Negro Renaissance before moving to Greenwich Village and establishing himself as a fixture in the bohemian circles of the downtown art world, which he now introduced to Baldwin. He took him to galleries and concerts, told him tall tales about his friend Ethel Waters and other famous figures, and introduced him to the jazz players W.C. Handy and Josh White. Importantly, he let him know these people weren't just celebrities. They were part of his inheritance, Baldwin would write, just as I was part of their hope. Much like a mystic, Beauford often spoke in parables, aphorisms, and other seemingly inscrutable statements. One, in particular, had a lasting impact and became a story Baldwin would talk and write about time and time again. Look, Beauford said one day as they walked along Broadway. They had stopped at a crosswalk, and he was pointing down at a gutter. What do you see? Baldwin saw nothing but a dirty puddle of water. Look again, Beauford said. Baldwin looked more closely this time and noticed a reflection of buildings moving like mercury in the gutter's black water, distorted and radiant. It was a life-changing lesson in light and perception. The reality of his seeing, he later recollected, caused me to begin to see. Now he saw everything anew through Beauford's eyes. Was a brown leaf really brown? No, not exactly. For he found that if he took the time to stare at it carefully enough, it actually contained many colors. And though black had been described to me as the absence of light, he later wrote, it became very clear to me that if this were true, we would never have been able to see the color black. The light is trapped in it and struggles upward, rather like the grass pushing up through the cement. It was humbling to be forced to realize that light fell down from heaven on everything, on everybody, and that the light was always changing. Baldwin was learning to see the world around him as an artist sees it, alive with color and shades of difference and detail and unexpected beauty. During these early visits to Beauford's studio, Baldwin also became his muse. Delaney was shy and always reluctant to paint nudes, but he had painted one of Emile's girlfriend, Jessie, so he was convinced to paint one of Baldwin, too. Embarrassed of his body, but encouraged by Jessie and Emile, Baldwin finally agreed. Baldwin is represented as a figure positioned on what appears to be a daybed, naked against a sumptuous background, evoking a vibrantly colored forest or jungle. Beautifully rendered in oil, the body is slender and muscular, posed elegantly, like a ballet dancer at rest. The figure is looking directly at the viewer, as if returning their gaze, or perhaps more apt, Beauford's. The use of light illuminates the figure's face in shades of languorous yellow, Beauford's favorite color. Even lighter shades of yellow create a halo effect around his head. It was uncommon for Beauford to write the title of a painting on the back of the canvas, but he did so for this one. He called it Dark Rapture.
Hi, good afternoon. Can we give another round of applause to Ron Butler? We were talking backstage and Ron said it took him a month to record the whole thing?
That's right.
A month, okay. And then before we get going, this event happened because of Luisa Heredia, so can we please give her another round of applause? Nick and I were talking, this is the first time he and I are meeting. This is also both of our first time in Palm Springs. Your airport is wonderful. And very, very happy to be here. And even more happy that Luisa brought us together, but also that we're here because of James Baldwin. And I think before I dive right in, I have lots of questions. This is such a hard time. This is a dark time, hard time, unprecedented, all of those things. That to be given a gift like this book, and as I was reading it, the love that you have for him, not only as your subject, but as a person, just came right through. So I think just to start, really a round of applause for Nicholas Boggs for this amazing book.
Thank you very much.
All right, so I'm gonna dive right in. We were talking about Jimmy, and then we were talking about Toni, and then I'm a huge Toni Morrison fan as well, and Nick said that there's a quote, that Toni Morrison quote, if there's a book that you wanna read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And you said that was a jumping off point for you for this book, to write this book.
Absolutely. I'll answer that question in just a second. First, I want to say thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you to Ron Butler. It was my dream since the moment I heard him read this audiobook to do an event with him. So thank you for this opportunity. This is really special. I want to thank Louisa, who is one of the great lights of my life. And New York's loss was definitely Palm Springs' gain. And I have long been a fan of Jose's. I believe that he's somebody who, across genre and projects, is writing very much in the tradition of James Baldwin. So it's an honor to speak with you.
Thank you. Okay.
Now I'll answer the question.
Yes.
Okay, so Toni Morrison.
Yeah, so that quote about if there's a book that you want to read that hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. So that was a jumping off point?
Well, I heard it later, and it spoke to what happened to me. So the very brief version is that I was an undergrad, and I discovered this out-of-print children's book. You can see an image from it now, called Little Man, A Story of Childhood, and it was at the Beinecke Library. And I found it in the library, and I went and read David Leeming's 1994 biography, which had one paragraph about Yoran Cazac. There he is. And I sent the second email of my life to David Leeming in 1996 saying, do you know anything about Yoran Cazac? He wrote back and he said, I never met him. I don't know anybody still alive who met him, and I believe he's deceased. So 7 years later, I moved to New York. I send more emails to art historians in Paris saying, do you know anything about this deceased obscure French painter, Yoran Cazac? 3 months later, the phone rings in my studio apartment in Brooklyn, raspy French accented voice. This is Yoran Cazac, I'm alive. I have many stories to tell you about Jimmy. And the short version is that led to bringing the book back into print, which took many years, and to doing research about this one relationship. But along the way, I discovered that there were sort of all these gaps, and I wanted to read the book of where the gaps were, like about his great loves, including Yoran Cazac, but more about Beauford Delaney, more about Lucien Happersberger, who he dedicated Giovanni's Room to, more about Engin Cezzar, his Turkish friend. And then I realized that actually by looking at love in his life, looking through the prism of love, you actually had to write about his whole entire life because it infused all of his writing, his fiction and his nonfiction. So I never thought I would write a biography, but that ended up sort of organically happening over the course of a couple decades.
A couple of decades, yes. So let's go back a little bit more. I know for me, I discovered Baldwin. I went to a middle school where the 8th grade teacher assigned The Bluest Eye. And it, Filipino kid I'm like, what am I reading? So then I went to the library and they directed me to the African American section of the library that's where I saw James Baldwin. And then I started reading. So that was my introduction, right? I'm just curious for you, what was your introduction to Baldwin?
This is really crazy because it was also in the 8th grade. But what's wrong with us? I was in Washington, D.C. I was in the English classroom at D.C. Public Schools, and I had a wonderful teacher named Mrs. Miles, Rita Miles. And on the wall of the classroom was drawings of famous black writers, including James Baldwin with these big eyes. And you'll see an illustration coming through that Yoran Cazac did of both of them that kind of reminded me of it years later. But anyway, I saw that, and my memory is seeing those amazing eyes. But I recently, after many years, spoke to my English teacher, and she said, oh no, you then got dressed up in a suit and came into your public school and gave a presentation on Baldwin's life in the 8th grade. So I guess I've been writing this book for 40-some years.
I would not be remiss if I don't mention the fact that this happened in our 8th grade.
We did not know this. This is not pre-planned.
But also, how many states there are in this country right now that are banning these books? I was in Alabama recently, finishing a book project that's not taking decades to do, but 4 years and counting. And I was stunned to be in Birmingham, Alabama, and the public school kids are not encouraged to read Baldwin or Morrison or Maya Angelou or Ralph Ellison. What I wanted to ask you is, getting to know Baldwin, especially in the era of YouTube, where you can just spend a whole day watching James Baldwin videos, right? Of course, the Raoul Peck documentary, right? Like, what's the difference between working on this book 20 years ago and now, where Baldwin is so kind of up there in Mount Rushmore of kind of part of the canon?
That's a great question because sometimes it looks like I had planned this whole thing, but actually when I was interested in Baldwin in the 90s, he was considered passé. Many of you may remember this moment. The Library of America of his collected works, nonfiction, had come out, and the New York Times trashed it, which is sort of unbelievable.
Morrison edited it, by the way, that collection.
Exactly. And so, it's been incredible to witness and gratifying to see the way that he's come back into public consciousness. The Black Lives Matter has a lot to do with that. Raoul Peck's wonderful film, Barry Jenkins' wonderful film, If Beale Street Could Talk. And, Baldwin was a great artist. Like, he would be with us no matter what, right? But for better or worse, the conditions of the world right now make his words all the more prescient. So I'm excited by it. I'm also sometimes... We live in the soundbite era, and sometimes Baldwin can be reduced by this, right? And part of what I was interested in was who is the man behind, right, the slogans, behind the appropriations? Who is the human being, so that we can see him in all of his dimensions and understand his work as fully as possible?
And one of the things we were talking about, because his life is a world on its own, right? I mean, it's really, it's I don't know. It's hard to kind of even think of a way to describe it. How did you arrive? When did you arrive? If you can share the moment when you're like, oh, I can structure this thing around his love life, around the people that he loved. When did that happen? That realization that that's the spine of this book?
Very, very late, because again, I didn't think I was writing a biography. I tried to get the book republished. That happened in 2018. In 2017, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture acquired these massive James Baldwin archives. So suddenly, a larger book seemed possible. But I was just focusing on this one slice, this one last great love with Yoran Cazac. And then I have to credit my agent because I was at a writing residency and she said, well, what are you writing about? What is she was so sick of me because we couldn't figure out the book. And I said, it's about love and relationships. And she's like, well, who else? And I was like, oh, wait, of course. I mean, it was Beauford Delaney, who you just heard about, who introduced Baldwin to Yoran Cazac in Paris in 1959. And Yoran is very similar, or kind of evokes Baldwin's great love, the Swissman Lucien Happersberger, who he dedicated Giovanni's Room to. And Engin Cezzar played Giovanni in an actor's studio rendition in Greenwich Village. So there was this through line that sort of emerged organically over this. It came together at that one moment.
And also it was fascinating. I don't know how many of you have read the whole thing, but I just could not get enough of it. So I read the whole thing and I'm thinking to myself, it's kind of inevitable, right? Like this was a way this. And thank you for saying that sometimes he gets reduced to this thing where when you read Baldwin and really listen to him, the love, just this emanating, borderless love is to me what comes across. And in a way, I think having this spine honors that legacy of him. So I have to ask, why do you think, having spent this time, why do you think Baldwin was attracted to men who were largely unavailable?
I think there are some gay men in this audience who might have some ideas about that.
I just asked like an Andy Cohen, watch what happens live question.
So no, seriously, I think you have to understand, you have to go way back. I'm not going to psychoanalyze him, but you have to understand his creative process and his own journey to self-love. So he grew up being called ugly, being called a sissy, being called frog eyes, and he later wrote that love is a war, love is a battle, love is a growing up. His own journey to self-love was incredibly hard won, and that's why he was able to kind of look at his love for the United States as this complex, risky love relationship. That's what he wrote about. But in his life, so you have to understand, he moves to Paris when he's like 24, and he falls in love with this 17-year-old Lucien Happersberger. And Baldwin's trying to write his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain. He can't do it. He doesn't even have a title. But Lucien pretends he has tuberculosis because he has a house, his family has a little chalet in the Swiss Alps. He takes Baldwin there, nurses Baldwin back to health, and they go on a hike up the mountains, and the title of the novel comes to him, Go Tell It on the Mountain. They go back a second time, Baldwin brings Bessie Smith records and his phonograph, and he's listening to Bessie Smith, and that's when he remembers Beauford. And he remembers that the language of black music and black culture, this was the voice that he had to recapture in the novel. So he found the voice. He went back a third time, and that's where he typed the end and took it down to a mailbox with Lucien. So he had this sort of original, primal scene almost of sort of an idyllic love where he was supported, where he could create. And he tried to recreate this throughout his life. At the end, when he typed the end, that's when Lucien told him, oh, and by the way, my girlfriend is pregnant. So they broke up. And so they would get back together over the course of their whole lives, but this yearning for a lost love that could only be temporarily reclaimed came to animate his art, not just subject matter-wise, a lot of love triangles and all of that, but also the creative process. So he'd go away to artist residencies, and he'd want to go there in the winter, so it would remind him of being in the Swiss Alps. So yes, there was this yearning in general for a kind of this unavailable kind of man, but in a way, the last thing I'll say is his first love was his art. His first love was writing, and I think on some level, he kind of knew that this structure worked for him creatively.
Again, having immersed yourself in this, I'm just curious, what surprised you most when it comes to all the research that you ended up doing? What was the most surprising part of it for you that you're like, oh, did not think this coming?
I love these questions when there's only one answer allowed. No, I've said elsewhere how surprised I was by sort of the tenderness of his writing, his unpublished writings in particular, the intimacy that we get through his letters, but I'll just tell one story that was probably the biggest surprise to me. So I met Yoran Cazac in 2003, and he died in 2005, but I spent a lot of time interviewing him in Paris. I met his wife, I met his son, who was Baldwin's godson. So he dies in 2005. We bring Little Men back into print. In 2018, I have the book contract, so I go to Tuscany. I had to go to all these really difficult places for my research. I go to Tuscany to meet Beatrice again because I want to see if she has documents or any new information. I'm looking for something to show me the texture of Baldwin's relationship with this great last love. So we're in her house, and this is in the book, but we're in her house in Tuscany. The sun is starting to set. She has all these documents on her bed, art catalogs, and she finds a 7-page unpublished love poem that Baldwin had written to her husband. And there's a rusty paperclip on it, and I realize that she has not seen this in 45 years. So it's written in French because Yoran didn't speak English, so Baldwin wrote it in French. So she spends however many minutes reading it out loud, translating it back into English for me as the sun sets over the Tuscan hills. This love poem written by this famous black writer, long gone, dedicated to her husband who was now deceased. And it was such a remarkable moment because I was like, this was full circle. I was like, this is what I've actually been looking for. It was you'll see, and Ron Butler reads this poem incredibly. It's about how they had spent times together at this hot spring, and then Baldwin went back to St. Paul de Vence, and Yoran stayed in Tuscany, and it's about waking up apart, and waking up and wondering, what is he doing? Has he brushed his teeth yet? It's about reading both of their horoscopes. You know how we've all done that, right? Reading the horoscope of the person we're missing. So it was so human, it was so tender, it was so beautiful, it was so real. He writes about wanting to take his own life if he cannot be with Yoran Cazac. I mean, he really reveals himself. And then when I was at the Schomburg a couple years later, I found in their archives the English version. So that was another full circle moment. But that was so surprising to come upon this kind of evidence of what the core of their relationship was like.
I'm sorry, I'm still stuck in that image that she was reading it, she was translating it. I'm just curious, what was her reaction like throughout all of this? Was she crying? Was she like,
She's a remarkable woman, and I'm so grateful to her because you'll see many of the illustrations and images are thanks to her permission. No, I mean, I'm giving part of the book away, but what she said, reading this poem makes me sad for Jimmy. That's what she said.
I'm going to ask one more question, and actually we're going to ask Ron to do a second reading.
Yes.
What light do Baldwin's relationships shed on his civil rights work? How did his search for love and its complications fuel his writing and his engagement with the world?
I think they were one and the same. I think politics was love and love was politics for him. I mean, if you look at The Fire Next Time, right, the canonical civil rights text, he says only love will open the gates, right, in order for black and white Americans to come together, metaphorically, like lovers, right, to kind of make freedom real, as he put it. So he understood the whole project, right, the civil rights project for him was a love project. It was a love project for both black and white Americans, but especially for white Americans who had to kind of come to grips this important concept of innocence, right? That's false innocence, this idea that the history doesn't matter, right? That structural racism doesn't persist, all of these things. He was trying to make it seem like the innocence constitutes the crime. No one is innocent, right? And that's what he was driving home again and again. And that was a message of love and indictment, but also possibility.
So another reading from Ron Butler.
I'm going to set the stage for this. This one has a Palm Springs connection, so this is why I chose it in part. Baldwin spent a lot of time in LA and Palm Springs trying to get writing the screenplay for Malcolm X that never happened for him, and so I just wanted you to know that this is part of this is happening in Palm Springs.
Okay. Baldwin was asked to introduce King at the event, and his off-the-cuff remarks signaled both his support of King and the extent to which he had moved to the left of him politically. It is not as it was thought of 10 years ago when Martin and those kids were marching up and down the highways, a Negro problem or a civil rights problem. What it is for all Americans now, and I mean this literally, from the bottom of my soul, is a matter of life and death. For his part, a visibly exhausted King, he looked 5 years wearier and 5 years sadder, Baldwin would later remark, was also moving to the left, if only by degree, in his call for direct action, as he put it in his brief speech. It was King's fourth event of that day alone, with 2 more sermons scheduled for the following morning. It was also the last time Baldwin would see him alive. 3 weeks later, April 4th, 1968, was a day in Palm Springs I will remember forever, Baldwin wrote. Billy D. Williams had come to town, he continued, and I felt confident that day. I was never to feel so confident again. He spoke openly to a reporter who had come by to lay my cards on the table, as he put it, and to state as clearly as I could what I felt the movie was about and how I intended to handle it. Baldwin was determined to cast the part of Malcolm himself, and while Columbia wanted James Earl Jones or Sidney Poitier, or even Charlton Heston of all people, basically in blackface, he wanted Williams to play the role. In fact, Baldwin had fallen for Williams romantically when they had met a couple of years earlier, and his crush was deepening now that they were staying together in Palm Springs, where a staff that included a cook and a driver were catering to their every need. With Williams, on the other side of the pool, doing what I took to be African improvisations to the sound of Aretha Franklin, Baldwin wrote, one of these staff members had brought the phone out to the pool, and when it rang, Baldwin picked up. It was an actor friend named David Moses, but his voice sounded odd. "Jimmy," he said, "Martin's been shot. He's not dead yet, but it's a head wound, so." Baldwin would later write that what happened next was a blur, except for the fact that they must have turned on the television set, and how he was weeping briefly, more in hopeless rage than in sorrow, with Billy trying to comfort me. The blur would continue through to King's funeral 5 days later. I went to Atlanta alone, Baldwin said. I don't remember why. But the details he did recall are revealing. How he wore the same dark suit he had recently bought to wear to the Du Bois event alongside King at Carnegie Hall. How he'd had to push his way into the packed church, where he saw Harry Belafonte seated next to Coretta Scott King, and then in the pew in front of him, there sat Marlon Brando, Sammy Davis, Eartha Kitt, covered in black, looking like a lost 10-year-old girl, and Sidney Poitier. As the surface washed over him, in waves, he would write, he did his best not to cry, for tears seemed futile, and I may also have been afraid, and I could not have been the only one, that if I began to weep, I would not be able to stop.
I want to ask a couple of questions about process. What was, I'm sure there were more than one, but can you describe some of the, most pressing challenges on working on a project as big as this?
I mean, I think having to go to Istanbul and St. Paul de Vence, this was very challenging. No, it was, the challenging part was finding the structure, and once I did that, it was laborious and kind of tedious, but I had to figure out how to map his entire life. I mean, he was a transatlantic commuter, is how he described himself. So he was traveling back and forth constantly. So just keeping track of where he was very difficult. Now, the FBI files were following him. There were files on him, and that was terrible. But there was one good thing about it, and that's that they were very good at tracking his airplane tickets. So I actually used the FBI files in a productive way to kind of help me figure out where he was. They got a lot of things wrong about him. They thought he was married to his sister, and they got the titles of novels wrong. And I would go away to artist residencies like MacDowell, where he went. And
you also had a residency there.
A couple, yeah. And all the other writers would show up with their computers, and all the visual artists would show up with their canvases, trucks full of canvases, and I would come in my pickup truck full of boxes of archives and books, as I only use paper. And so people thought I was a visual artist, and in a way, I was, because you'd come into my studio, and it would just be, I'd spend 2 weeks not writing at all, just moving around, like note cards with places and parts of his books that I was going to draw on and secondary sources. So it was kind of like a collage. I had to come up with this sort of maniacal system in order to kind of do the sort of cutting back and forth between sources that was necessary. I really wanted this book to, it's called a love story because it's about love, but it's narrative. It's written as a narrative. It's written through stories, it's sort of to pull you in like a novel does, hopefully, because I love biographies, but I also love fiction, and I love narrative nonfiction, and I really wanted this book to have that feel. So there Baldwin is with his typewriter, and in the back is a drawing. That painting is by Yoran Cazac, who's there. So I can also tell you about some stories about going particular places that were challenging but then gratifying. But figuring out that kind of like collage structure was crucial.
Well, actually, do share one like that was in terms of tracking that down.
Okay. So there's an interlude in the book, and in the interlude, Baldwin goes to Corsica for 7 months, where he's trying to figure out how to write another country. And then the second part of it, he goes south first for the first time. This is 1957. And no Baldwin scholar had ever found the house that Baldwin had lived in Corsica. So I got a Bob Caro, the great biographer, endows a little fellowship that I got, and he has a book called Working, where he talks about how you have to turn every page and go to every place. So I took that fellowship and I went to Corsica. I brought my mother with me. And thank God I brought her, because she marched down to town hall. Neither of us spoke French very well, and somehow found out the house that he stayed in up on the hill. And it was at this house that he wrote a scene from his life about, he was going through a breakup with Arnold, a young jazz musician. And he decides to like climb over the terrace with his glass of brandy. He goes down into the water and he considers drowning himself. He thinks of Virginia Woolf. He thinks about putting like rocks in his pockets. And then he has an epiphany. He realizes he needs to write another country. So this was a big moment in his life. So we go to the house, we find it, we knock on the door, and nobody answers. So it's hot. It's a hot summer. So I decided to walk down to the water to retrace his steps, and at least we could see the place where he had contemplated this act. But we look back, and on the terrace and the wall that he jumped down from, a woman was doing laundry. So, intrepid biographer that I am, I jump behind a bush. But my mother goes, bonjour! And next thing you know, we're up in the house. It's unchanged from the time he lived there. We spend the entire day there, and so I was able to really capture the place. So I said to Bob Caro later, you're right, turn every page, go to every place, but also, Bob, always bring your mother.
Speaking of Bob Caro, Master of the Senate, like his magisterial biography of Lyndon B. Johnson. What other books, as you were, there's the research part, the reporting part, then the writing part, right? Were there any particular book or books that you looked at as some sort of a model?
Well, first of all, I just want to note that Ron Butler did bring his mother tonight. So can we hear it for Ron Butler's mother here?
She's here somewhere.
This is a really tough question because it forces me to admit something that I shouldn't admit, but I will. I have before. When I got this book contract, I had never read a biography from start to finish.
They're tough.
They're hard, and I would usually do the things that a lot of us do is I'd look in the index. I'd probably read David Leeming's whole biography from start to finish through the index, but I had never actually sat down and read it. And I actually think this worked in my favor. I did read some that I loved, like Hermione Lee's Virginia Woolf biography is incredible. There are many great biographies, literary biographies in particular. But I actually think it worked in my favor because I didn't have a preset idea about how the book should read or be structured. I didn't want it to be like a kind of all the minutia, right? I wanted it to have this narrative feel. So it's actually novels, And my friend Ilian Wu wrote the book Master, Slave, Husband, Wife, which won the Pulitzer last year. And she sort of said the same thing. Her book is nonfiction, but we really bonded during the process of writing our books about like how novels in general, there wasn't a particular one, but how novels also inspired us. And I love Flaubert's Parrot. That's a great novel, but it's sort of about biography in a way. So I was inspired by like messing with the genre a little bit. I mean, Jeff Dyer has the book Out of Sheer Rage, which is about being unable to write a biography about D.H. Lawrence. That's the whole book, and it's brilliant. And so I wanted to do something kind of like that, but I also realized I had all this new archival material, and I had stories that I needed to tell. So I had to find a way of doing it in a way that was interesting and fascinating to me as a work of writing.
You know, as I was reading it, I was sharing with Nick that I find Gore Vidal and James Baldwin really fascinating, right? Like they were openly gay almost at the same time, but being gay wasn't the primary thing that, you know, they talked about it, people know of them. And it's interesting because when you get to know Baldwin's life, like some of the criticism that he was getting from other leaders in the Black community about who were homophobic and who were, I'm just curious, how do you see Baldwin as a gay icon?
Well, I just want to say, first of all, like one of the things that I admire so much about Baldwin was his willingness to change his mind about various things and to be really honest in assessing his past self. So he wrote this essay, called The Male Prison, where he kind of critiques Gore Vidal for being kind of, it's really hard to explain, but almost like internalized homophobia, right? But in the end, Baldwin later realized that actually he was critiquing himself, he's writing about his earlier self. Because Baldwin has such a complicated, I think, richly complicated relationship to identity, period, and in particular, gay identity. Baldwin didn't believe in any identities. He didn't believe in black, white, gay, straight, male, female. At the end of his career, he was saying we're all androgynous. Each contains the other. Black and white and black, male and female. That doesn't mean he didn't understand that these categories had weight and history and did damage, but he was not willing to let the oppressor define him. He didn't want to be known as just a Negro writer, as he put it. And he also didn't want to be known as a homosexual writer. He said that homosexual was a verb, not a noun.
Same thing that Gore Vidal would say, yeah.
And Michel Foucault. Yeah, people don't get angry at Michel Foucault for saying it, but they get angry at Baldwin. I mean, Baldwin was in no closet either. I mean, when he was asked, people asked him, well, what was it like? You grew up black, gay, and poor. That must have been hard. He said, I hit the jackpot. I have all this great perspective, and he had the facility with language to do it. So, I think he is a queer icon, but I think he's a queer icon in that very expansive sense, where you understand queerness as also being about race, nation, everything together.
But, it was interesting. I think part of the renaissance of Baldwin, clearly the Black Lives Matter movement, Raoul Peck's documentary, during that era when people were quoting him, right? And we talked about this a little bit before we went out here to talk, but how people reduce Baldwin to so many. I'm just curious, as here you are with this, in many ways, definitive biography of Baldwin. What do you think people misunderstand about him the most?
I think as often happens with iconic figures, we reduce him to sound bites. We see him on YouTube, which is wonderful, but then we just reduce him to his quotes, and often he's misquoted. There are a couple of wonderful quotes by other people that are often ascribed to James Baldwin, but they're not by him. Like that famous one about you have the right. I'm not saying it correctly, but you have the right to do anything and think anything, like free speech, as long as it doesn't negate my right to exist.
Yes,
that's not James Baldwin. I'm sorry to say. That's Robert Jones. That's the great novelist Robert Jones, contemporary novelist Robert Jones. There's a few of them. I definitely stopped correcting people on social media because that would be a full-time job and how annoying. But it's, and so what happens is then he becomes a symbol, right? He becomes inhuman. And when all of his writing was about the messiness of being human, right? To reduce him to a symbol seemed like, especially in these days when we need to see him in all of his multiplicities. We need to see, he was doing intersectionality before it was the thing. And so in order to really get the importance of his message as it cuts across all of these differences, you have to look well beyond the sound bites and understand his humanity so that we can get back in touch with ours as a country, quite frankly.
Which is now, this is something I think about a lot, is how can his work inform how we navigate what we're navigating with right now?
I'm going to send this question right back to him, because this man is actually doing it on the front lines in all kinds of ways. Because I feel Baldwin called himself a witness. That's how he described himself. And I am no James Baldwin, but I do consider myself as a kind of witness to his life. This is what happened to me almost by accident, but that's what I've done. But it's folks like you who are really out there doing the writing, the speaking, the mobilization. So what do you think?
You know, I was really lucky. I was so lucky that I read Morrison in 8th grade and then Baldwin freshman year. I found out I was undocumented freshman year, and Notes of a Native Son was its own constitution to me, right? This idea that I have to define myself and not let other people define what it means to be an illegal gay faggot alien, right? Who's Filipino, who looks like this, when his name is Jose.
Jackpot. That's the jackpot.
So this idea that how do you not live your life, keep having to explain yourself, and at the same time do that. Like there's that balance. And I think when I think about him, and this came across really in this piece of art that is this book, is how hard it is to love. Like, love is hard. I actually think it's harder than hate. And, you know, when I go, Nick and I were talking, when I go to places like in Ohio or Wisconsin and I'm getting, you know, protested on because they invited an illegal alien to come speak at the school, I think of me like exhibiting love. Right? Like, please tell me that this quote is Baldwin. I love America more than any other country in the world, and exactly for that reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. That is a Baldwin quote.
Yes.
Great. Because Lord knows.
And actually, that's exactly the quote. So well done. That's an exact quote.
That is the quote. I love America more than any other country in the world, and precisely for that reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. So now I want to focus on the her part. And again, the book chronicles his love for these, you know, unavailable men. Some of them, right? Most of them. Can we talk about his love for women? I think, you know, his relationship with Toni Morrison, to me, we were talking, and I loved hearing you say this, how they informed each other's work.
Thanks for asking that, because the book is structured through these four great loves who were men that he collaborated with, men that he dedicated books to, but interwoven throughout the entire book are these incredibly important relationships with women, beginning with his mother, Bertus, beginning with his school teacher, Bill Miller, who took him out when he was 10 years old to go see Bette Davis on screen, and that's when Baldwin was like, wait a second, my eyes aren't ugly. My eyes are amazing. They're powerful, you know. Up through Mary Painter, his best friend in Paris. They had these incredible letters. Up through Lorraine Hansberry, had a huge impact on James Baldwin. Maya Angelou, Nina Simone. But we can talk about Toni Morrison for a second, because I think she's really, really, really important figure. If Beale Street Could Talk, which he dedicated to Yoran Cazac, of course, is a black heterosexual love story. But one of the things I write about is how it's also basically modeled on his love affair, an interracial queer love affair in Europe with Yoran Cazac. So all of these layers are happening in Baldwin's life. You have to look at his work and his life together. But Baldwin was writing for the first time from the first person perspective of a woman, a black woman, pregnant black woman, Tish. And he was really struggling with it. Because he had these two warring impulses. He wanted it to be realistic, but he was also kind of talking about his love for Yoran. So you have this kind of contradictory voice where it sounds like a black woman, but it also sounds like James Baldwin. But he was also imagining himself later in his life as androgynous. So the novel's really complicated that way. Anyway, he's in St. Paul de Vence, and Toni Morrison comes to visit him, and he makes some popcorn, and it's late at night, and they stay up all night. He takes her down into his writing room, which he calls his torture chamber, and he reads the entire novel to her from start to finish to see if he got the voice right. And she gave him pointers. She thought he did really great, but she's Toni Morrison. She had ideas. But one thing that we were talking about backstage just for a second, but Tony really, really impacted him because, listen, Baldwin had come up and he'd had to write for the white gaze to get published in the New Yorker, to get published, Giovanni's Room. He had to write. He was writing for black people, but he was also writing for white liberals until he decided that this wasn't working in terms of that post-civil rights movement. He was like, what's going on here? And it was Tony who sort of has those famous sayings about, not writing for the white gaze. And Baldwin wasn't either later in his career. If Beale Street Could Talk it was a black love story set in Harlem. Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone was about a black love story again. Just Above My Head, it should be a classic, black queer love and the black family, an accepting black family, going against this stereotype that black families are somehow less accepting of their gay and lesbian children, which is not necessarily the case. And so he was not writing for the white gaze. Little Man, this children's book that I brought back, he was written in black English. Baldwin has a really important late essay called If Black English Isn't a Language, Then Tell Me What Is. And it was all about how the black vernacular is it's a work of art, black language, and also an act of resistance. So Tony, I think, had a big, big impact on him and towards sort of that aesthetic and political shift late in his life.
And again, when you look at his relationship with Maya, there's a great, I don't know if you've seen the YouTube video of Nikki Giovanni interviewing Jimmy. And Nikki was young. I mean, and to your point, by the way, he loved being challenged. He loved actually being called in to change his mind. And and I wonder when we talk about what he means for this moment, I wonder what about his life and kind of this idea that we're in each other. We were talking backstage that famous debate between Buckley and Baldwin, I'm sure you've seen on YouTube, when Baldwin says, what's happening to that woman, to that black woman being hit by a cattle prod is tragic. But that man, what's happened to that white man holding that cattle prod is even more tragic, right? That the racists and the racism. What do you make of that idea that we are in each other's battles?
Yeah, I mean, that's it's hard to wrap my head around when he would say, that racism damages the racist more than it damages the object of racism or the subject of racism. But I also think, the reason that he was able to do this, he had an insatiable curiosity about other people. But Richard Avedon, his good friend, was shocked when he'd go to bars with him. And Baldwin would sit down with people, totally racist white people, and talk to them for hours. Not trying to change their mind, actually. Trying to understand what made them tick. And that's why he was able to write Giovanni's Room. That's why he was able to write his amazing short story, Going to Meet the Man, written from the perspective of a white sheriff in the South. He understood, as he said, black people have to understand white people better than they understand themselves. That's what he said, and he did. And that's kind of an incredible and endangering place for him to put himself in. This was a very small man who went down south, where crosses were being burned, and he reported about desegregation, and it had a cost. It really cost him. I mean, he wanted to be an artist. He didn't want to be a spokesman. He didn't want to be, marching. He wanted to be in France writing novels and directing plays and making films. But he understood that he had this unique position. And because he had the novelist's gift, right, for getting inside the minds of other people and being open enough to do that, he was able to teach all of us, so much in the process.
I have to say, though, that that's probably what I carry with me the most when I'm out in places that I'm in danger. I'm like, if Baldwin could do that, I can go do this, right? It's fine. I can, but then the costs, being part of activist circles as well, when people say to me, why do you have to keep reaching out to people like that? And my answer usually is, well, if I don't, then what happens, right? However, I'm not saying that that's what everybody should do, right? But I think it comes at that kind of cost. So now I have to ask, so now that this book is out in the world as a New York Times bestseller, what has been the reaction you've been getting? Because you've been in a book tour now for 3 weeks?
More than that, yeah.
More than that, yeah.
Over a month now, yeah.
Yeah, what has been the reaction like just hearing from people?
Completely surreal. I mean, I spent 20 years working on this book and in my own room, mostly, going these places, but a lot of time just by myself writing, and to have it like accepted and greeted by people is really totally a beautiful experience. It's been like no complaints whatsoever. I'm so grateful to you guys for coming tonight as well.
And this is one of my last questions I want to ask you is, his correspondence with Lucien, can you say that? Happersberger, did I say that right? Whom he called the one true love story of my life, is under seal until 2037. What do you expect from it?
Absolutely nothing. And I'll tell you why. Lucien Happersberger did not really write very much or read very much. So I don't actually think that those letters will be that revelatory. They're also sealed are the letters to Beauford Delaney, although some of those are now available in Knoxville at the library there where Beaufort is from. People sometimes focus on these sealed letters and forget just how voluminous these archives are. They're massive at the Schomburg, also at the Beinecke, but at the Schomburg there's so much there. But in a sense, I did feel that I had to find ways of writing around those gaps. Those gaps still exist, but that's where meeting people, like tracking down people still alive and interviewing him. And at the Beinecke, David Leeming did interviews with all of these people, Lucien, Engin, Baldwin, David Baldwin, his brother. Like 20, 30 people. They had not been transcribed. I spent the pandemic transcribing them. So just to give you an example, not to give the ending away, but I'm sorry to say that James Baldwin did die at a certain point. And his great love, Lucien, came back to his bedside, and I transcribed him narrating Baldwin's final days and hours, and I was able to include that in the book. What a remarkable honor to be able to work with that kind of archival information. To me, that's more powerful than any letter that may not be available. Yeah.
Because yes, I wanted to ask, like, are you seeing a part 2? Is there like what happened?
No way. This onward and to the next project. Yeah. No, not.
Anything else you want to tell us about in what other ways is this book going to appear? Like, meaning, it's this amazing book. Do you foresee that it can exist in other places?
I did just come from LA yesterday, but no comment. But no, what I do want to say is that for those of you who are not familiar with Jose's work, to go out and read it, because no, he really is working in the tradition of Baldwin. So I hope that this is an opportunity to get to read my book, but also to read his important work.
And I'll say maybe this part is this next book that I've only been working on for 4 years. It's done I'm doing it next month. Thankfully, you have a Starbucks open at 4:30 in the morning. So I was there from 4:30 to 6:30 writing. My jumping off point was a Baldwin quote where he said, "I'm only black if you think you're white. I'm only black if you think you're white." I grew up in a California that is 60% Latino and Asian. So where do Latinos and Asian fit in that concept? Are we going to go white or are we going to go black? I think some of us know the answer to that question. Now, as part of our Mutual Aid Admiration Society, I want to end this by saying, speaking of Morrison and Baldwin, there's this great quote that I think comes from Baldwin that Morrison says a lot, that she said a lot, which is, your crown has been bought and paid for. Your ancestors, your grandparents, your parents, they already gave it up for you. It's already done. Now you can love yourself. It's already possible. So I love that. And I love that in memory of this book that is enveloped with all the love that a writer can possibly have for its subject. So thank you for that. And thank you for giving us this lovely, lovely book.
Thank you so much, Jose. And thank you, Palm Springs.
Thank you.